Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Wells and I'm with the Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust and the North Quabbin Partnership. We are very grateful that everyone took the time tonight to be here as part of this webinar. We had quite a few people who registered, and it looks like we already have more than 50 who have Zoomed in with us so far. We expected tonight's topic to be of interest because it has to do with the value piece, both in terms of ecological value and financial value. And we are thrilled to have two really wonderful, talented presenters here with us tonight to share their expertise. We have Krista and Ellen, who we'll be hearing from in a little bit. This is actually the third webinar of a 7-part monthly series that we're doing. So if you've been here for the full ride so far, and I recognize some of you have been, then great, it's good to see you again, welcome back. If you haven't and you'd like to check out the 2 previous webinars, they were recorded, so they're available at that link that's at the bottom of the screen right now. And that same link will take you to the descriptions for all of the remaining webinars. So if you haven't had a chance to register for those, then we hope that you will. It's hard to believe we're already almost halfway through. The funding for this project comes from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and their Working Forest Initiative, which is administered by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. And the workshops themselves are organized in partnership with Mount Grace, the group that I'm with, and our good friend Paul Catanzaro, who hopefully you'll recognize from the last 2 webinars with UMass Amherst, and our friends at the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition. I wanted to mention 2 other very important people in this effort. We have Kate Sutcliffe, who's an AmeriCorps TerraCorps member helping out Mount Grace this year, and Olivia Lukasik, who's a graduate student with UMass Amherst, and they've both been tremendous assets to the team and doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make these programs possible. And they're both here tonight to help with the chat and the tech issues in particular. So we'd like to start by getting a sense of who's here tonight. So Olivia is going to launch some poll questions. And if you haven't seen this before, it should show up in the middle of your screen as a new box. And if you scroll down with your cursor, you should see 4 different questions. You can go ahead and answer those. And if you're on the phone, then don't worry, we'll summarize the results in a couple minutes here when Olivia closes the poll. And if you've been here before, you might recognize some of these questions. And when you're done, you just hit submit. It's a blue box at the bottom. We'll give it another moment or 2, and Olivia can close that out and let us know how it looks. Olivia, is the poll closed?
I just closed it, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Do you have the results that you can share?
I think they should be, oh, share results. I have to share them. That was my bad.
There we go. Okay, great. So it's looking like more than half of the people who are here tonight own land, but interesting split. Not everyone here tonight lives on that property. Looks like most people do visit it if they don't live there. And I'm assuming if they answered that it wasn't applicable, it's because they live on the property. And interesting, so almost 2/3 of people who are here tonight are using their property for agriculture or forest products. And that in particular is will come into play with both the financial and the ecological valuation piece. Okay, well, thanks for getting warmed up and participating in that bit of a poll. Speaking of questions, I also wanted to note that there were some folks who submitted questions ahead of time, and those were all shared with the presenters. So to the extent they're able to, they'll be working them into their presentations tonight. But there were a couple of questions that seemed a little bit outside of the scope of what we'll be able to talk about tonight or in the remaining webinars. And those had to do with land management, and in particular, mowing of fields and dealing with invasive species. So if that was one of your questions, now is when Olivia or Kate are going to put email addresses in the chat box for both Paul and I. And we really hope that you will follow up with us by email outside of the webinar, so we can still try to get your answer, get you some answers to your questions, so you're not left hanging on that front. Okay, so tonight, the plan is we're going to start on the ecological side with Krista, and there'll be some time to ask her questions about her presentation. And then we'll segue over to Ellen and talk a bit more about the appraisal piece. Same deal, there'll be questions for Ellen in particular. And if all goes according to the plan, we should still have a little bit of time left over at the end for general questions about whatever else may come up. Okay, and we have one last poll before we get started with Krista's presentation to get us in the frame of thinking about ecological value in particular. So if Olivia has just launched this, so it has to do with whether the types of land use planning that you've been engaged with so far, and it's a multiple choice question. Great. So Olivia will be able to see when most people have answered, and then she'll close that poll. And Betsy, that's true. You should be able to click more than one box. Oh, it looks like, okay. Well, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without some kind of wonkiness. So pick your favorite, the one that you think has been the most beneficial in your land use planning so far. Sorry about that. Great. Well, the winner then is having family conversations, which is directly tied to the first webinar we had. So maybe might not be correlated to that, but it is interesting. And then legal tools is tied for second place. So that's, or I'm sorry, the land survey. Okay, so there's a pretty good spread here with the types of things that people have been engaged with so far. So Krista will talk about some of those aspects in more detail. But before I hand it over to Krista, I wanted to make one more note, which is that the first 20 families who registered for tonight's webinar got a personalized map of their property. So if you got that, it would have come in by email yesterday. And Krista is going to spend a few minutes to orient you to that map. If you didn't get a map, that's totally fine. It's not necessary for the webinar tonight. It's purely an incentive to spur registration. And Krista will be talking about a free online tool that's available for anyone who wants to play around with it and see what pops up for your property. But don't worry about trying to figure that out as Krista's talking, because we're going to send an email after tonight's webinar with some instructions for how to use that tool. So with that said, we're very happy to have Krista Collins with us tonight. She's the Director of Land Protection at Sudbury Valley Trustees, which is a regional accredited land trust that works in a set of communities, 36, I think, between Worcester and Boston. And Krista's been doing this work for a longtime Sudbury Valley Trustees, is an excellent organization. So we're very thankful to have her here tonight. And Krista, you can take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Sarah, and thank you all for coming. This is an amazing turnout. Yeah, I just love to see people from, I think I saw somebody from Indiana or Illinois, which is really great. I want to know how Sarah got a hold of my high school yearbook for that picture. It's really, really old. As she said, I've been doing this for a while, almost 20 years. Yeah, mostly at Sudbury Valley Trustees. I did work for a short while at Nashua River Watershed Association. So I'm mostly familiar with kind of East Central Massachusetts, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight is sort of universal to doing land conservation. I mean, if you were to go way out west, you might be running into different issues of mineral rights and things like that. But for the most part, we in the conservation world in Massachusetts and even in New England tend to think about sort of a lot of the same issues in terms of conserving land. So what I'm going to do is share with you tonight some of the resources that are available to help you get an understanding of the ecological value of your land, and also talk about what a land trust might be looking for in deciding what conservation opportunities to pursue. And I'm going to share a few slides. Okay. So it looked like there were a fair number of people that live on their land or visit their land frequently. And you all know your land better than anyone. For folks who work for a land trust, especially those of us who cover larger surface areas, we need to use remote tools to help us understand what land is most important for conservation. So we spend a lot of time looking at maps and aerial photos like this one, and poring over data layers about wetlands and endangered species, prime farmland, fun stuff like that. But in the end, there's really no substitute for being on the land. You find that when you look at a lot of aerial photos and maps like this, you start thinking that everything is really flat. But, of course, this is the same property. And while the meadow is flat, we realize that we're looking at a pretty steep hillside down there at the end of the meadow. So that's why when we connect with a landowner who's interested in talking about conservation, the first thing we do is say, let's go find a time to walk the land together, because there's really no better way to learn a piece of land. But the reality is that we spend most of our time sitting at our computers and looking at maps online. And some of you might be surprised at how much data there is out there about our Massachusetts landscape. And I want to acknowledge that this could feel like kind of an invasion of privacy. But this data, most of which is kind of put together and stored by the state, is really important for planners, for public works employees, for emergency personnel, and of course, conservation professionals to sort of make decisions about our work. We have access to data now that shows us which part of the state, both inland and coastal, are most vulnerable to flooding in major storms. This map is showing an area of Framingham and Southborough. And you can see the orange areas along what's called Angelica Brook are really vulnerable to flooding. And this is data that was created by the Nature Conservancy, and it's more up to date than the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency maps, which everybody uses for flood insurance and stuff like that. And the FEMA data isn't really keeping up with climate change. So it's great that we have the Nature Conservancy to create this new data, so we can really look at which areas are most vulnerable. And the property up here outlined in red is actually one that we're working on conserving right now. It's almost the headwaters of Angelica Brook. So we can look at this and say, gosh, if this property were to be developed, that would be even more devastating for these downstream neighborhoods that are already prone to flooding. So that's one way we can use this type of data. It's hugely important as the climate warms and sea level rises and storms become more intense. We know where the wetlands are. This map shows all this kind of green splotchy area is the wetlands on this property. And that helps, in part, helps planners guide development away from where people's septic systems might pollute drinking water wells. But in this case, this was another piece of property that we conserved in the town of Bedford. I can see that all these wetlands are connected off the property. And if we were to zoom out even more, you would see that over here on the left is the Concord River, which is entirely protected here as part of the Great Meadows National Wildlife Refuge. So I can see that this is part of a much bigger wetland complex. And what happens on this property would have direct impact to the quality of the Concord River, which happens to be the drinking water supply for the town of Billerica. So we start to see, using maps, how things are so interconnected in the landscape. We know from our mapping where the best timberland is and where the most productive agricultural soils are. This is a project we're working on in Holliston, and all the pink area is all the best agricultural soils we have in Massachusetts. And this was important because this project got funding from the Department of Agricultural Resources to put a permanent agricultural restriction on the property. And they look at the soils data to determine which are the most important projects to support with their funding. So at a land trust, how do we make use of all this data and what does it mean for your land? And I touched on that a little bit by talking about the APR. A lot of funding is driven by knowing what these resources and the attributes are. But we know that not every piece of remaining land in Massachusetts can or should be preserved. And one way that we identify land that's best for conservation is by looking for blocks of land and corridors of land. About 25% of Massachusetts is already permanently protected. And in case you're curious, there's another 25% that's already developed, and that means 50% is still up for grabs. We know too that for a lot of species to be viable in the state, especially large mammals like bear and moose, they need a lot of contiguous acres to roam. Having blocks or corridors of land that are largely unbroken by roads also allows those big species to roam, but it also allows populations of smaller animals to avoid becoming inbred and maybe a little unhealthy. As the climate warms more too, some populations of species, both plant and animals, are slowly moving northward and need north-south corridors of unbroken land to move safely. So sometimes we even look beyond Massachusetts when we're thinking about what is the most important land to protect. And I know this map is probably very familiar to Sarah because it's the Quabbin to Cardigan initiative. So groups of people out here starting, as far south as the Quabbin Reservoir, looking at ways to connect unbroken corridors of land all the way up to the White Mountain National Forest. So that would be a good way to get moose wandering up and down. Sometimes we look for land that can protect water supply, public water supply, and surface water too, of course, but often these lands are protected by municipalities and their water supply districts. But there is data that's available from the state that shows where public wellheads are or potential wellhead sites. Another really important thing we look for is priority wildlife habitat. And this is a property in Berlin, Mass, that we're trying to protect. And you can see these big blobs of green. These are from a data set that's called Biomap 2. And as you could probably guess, there was a Biomap 1, and soon there's going to be a Biomap 3. Over many years, the state has been collecting data, a lot of which is collected by our Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, but also some data is collected by volunteers who then submit it to Natural Heritage. And these are verified sightings of rare plants, rare animals, and those all play an important part in this biomap data layer. But it also considers things like unbroken forest core. So where you have, like I was talking about, those blocks of land, where you have those big contiguous blocks where there are no roads going through them, no houses, Those are areas that the state has identified as really important to protect for biodiversity, but also they help protect our water quality, they help protect the air we breathe. So there's a lot of merit on a lot of levels to protecting these large swaths of land and to protecting, in some cases, small pockets of really important habitat. So these are some of the data sets that we look at, and at an organization like Sudbury Valley Trustees that has staff and an office, we have our own geographic information system where we have a couple of computers where I can just sit down and pull up these maps anytime I want to, and play around with them and reformat them and everything. But there's also ways that anybody can access this data through a state website, and that's called Oliver. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second and then share my other screen. So you can see up here, this is the address to get you to Oliver, but don't worry about that because I always just Google Mass GIS Oliver and it takes me to this state, to this site. So if we zoom out all the way, this is what the screen looks like when you first go to the website. And what you can do is, if you want to look up your own piece of property, you can go up here to a town list. And I'm going to go to my office in Sudbury. So I scroll down to Sudbury. And I know that my office is down here by the National Wildlife Refuge. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. A little bit more. And as you can see, when you get into a pretty fine scale, that you'll start to see all the individual parcels show up. And you can actually, using this little information button, you can click on any parcel and get pretty up-to-date ownership information. And this is, again, all public record from assessors data. So if you click on the tax parcels layer, you can find out all this information about the owner. And there we are, Sudbury Valley Trustees. Then over on the right side, we have all of these different data sets, many of which I just showed you in the other maps. But if I wanted to see something about the conservation values of our property, I could look here under conservation and recreation and find the natural heritage data. That was the biomap that I showed a little while ago. So if I click on, let's say, priority habitats of rare species, it's a little hard to see, but I hope you can see that this yellow line popped up with some cross-hatching, and then this code PH 1436. So that means that everywhere under this yellow cross-hatching is area that has been identified by the State Natural Heritage Program as priority habitat for some endangered species, maybe several endangered species. And the reason it doesn't say like Eastern box turtle here is because they try to be a little subtle about what species they're trying to protect in a given area, because we don't want people going out and picking rare plants, and we don't want people going out and taking Eastern box turtles home for pets. So if you wanted to find out, if you had land that had a rare species on it, you can contact the Natural Heritage Program, and they will tell you what that species is. But you should have a good reason, like you're going to conserve your land. So that's one layer you can look at, and if you don't want to look at it anymore, you can just unclick it. Unclick it there. There are, if you want to know if there are any trails nearby, because that's another thing that we look for sometimes, is, as we've probably all seen during the pandemic, more and more people have gone outside and taken to the trails to find for something to do, but also, finding a lot of solace in nature. I know SVT, a lot of our reservations have really seen a lot of increased use over the past year. So when we look at a piece of land, we think too about what are those recreational opportunities for people, especially in more developed areas where we really, people want to get out. They don't have their own property that they can recreate on. So where can we make those trails connections? So So this has their data layers for long distance trails like the Mohawk Trail or the Bay Circuit Trail, but also some more local trails. And you can see that just popped up this little red dashed line here. So, you know, if this is the kind of thing that's interesting to you, I would really encourage people to just play around with this. It's fun. You can even print your own map, give it a title and print it out. So I know it's not for everybody, but there is a lot of information in here, and it is a very good tool to use. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, go back to my old screen. And Sarah mentioned that some of you had received a map that looks something like this if you were one of the early registrants. So the data that's shown on here is pretty much the same as, not pretty much, it is the same as what you would find in Oliver. It's just sort of different color scheme here, but all of this orange land is conservation easements held by Mass Wildlife. We've got a wildlife management area over here in green. You can see that there's some kind of biomap, what's called critical natural landscape along the river. Maybe that's for some fish species or something. I don't know this area that well. The other things that pop out at me when I look at this map are the property that's highlighted in red, which is the property of interest on this map, has these two little streams originating on it or almost on it. So that's, you know, maybe some habitat that we would want to see protected. I also like that it's starting to form a connection between these two big areas of conserved land. So, you know, I don't know what's going on over here, but that might be a really, you know, we might be starting to see a wildlife corridor there if this land were to be protected. There might be some trails that could go across this land and connect these areas, or not, because maybe you don't want trails going through the biomap priority habitat. So what it comes down to really in the end is that you know, there are things that conservationists want to see for land, and then there are things that landowners want to see for land. And the more you know about the property that you live on, the more you can guide your decisions. Maybe you would like to see some public access on your land, but maybe you want some privacy. So by understanding where these resources are, where the sensitive areas are, you can start to make those decisions with a little bit more information under your belt. So I hope that covers kind of most of the data that people would want to access, but I'm also happy to take questions.
Great. Does anyone have thank you, Krista. Does anyone have a question that they want to share and unmute themselves and ask? Okay. While people are thinking of that, I'll just add the map that Krista was just showing. The other thing that I find helpful about it is it shows which types of conservation groups are active in your area. So if you're at the point where you're wondering, well, maybe I want to do conservation, but who do I even call first? If you play around with a tool like Oliver, you look at that map, it can give you a sense of who you might call to get an idea of how to get started on the conservation pathway.
That's a really good point. And when you're thinking about the long term of your land, especially if you don't necessarily plan to continue to own it, maybe you want to put it into the care and control of a conservation group, or maybe you want to give it to the town that you live in. But knowing a little bit about each of those entities and how they might be able to manage the land would be an important thing to consider. I just saw a question pop up in the chat.
Yes, so the question is from James. Krista, it's about how conservation groups feel about sustainable forest management and the Chapter 61 current use enrollment program.
Good question. It will probably vary among land trusts, but I know that you know, there are a number of landowners that we've worked with that have done forestry on their land, and you know, I think, we always want to see it done sustainably, and usually that's the case when there's a DCR forest cutting plan, forest management plan. In other parts of New England, there are land trusts that have more specific focuses. So there's some land trusts that are really focused on preserving agricultural land. There's some land trusts that really maybe emphasize more wild lands that are not going to be working lands, or specifically for habitat protection. But I would say that for the most part across Massachusetts, the land trusts that are, anywhere east of 95, 128 are going to be pretty comfortable with the idea of some active land management, whether it's forestry or agriculture. And Chapter 61 is a great tool for landowners. I mean, everybody probably knows that it's not permanent protection, but as a way of keeping the land open and working, and reducing the tax burden for landowners, it's a great tool to have.
Great.
Yes, and it's completely compatible with conservation restrictions. In fact, even sometimes when we acquire a piece of land that's in Chapter 61, we just leave it in Chapter 61 and kind of let the clock run out, because there's no point in taking it out.
Good questions. Okay, well, people are thinking of more. We can go ahead and segue into the appraisal piece, and we'll have time at the end if there are questions that pertain to anything that Krista just mentioned. So to help get us in the frame of mind to think about now financial value opposed to the ecological value, we have one more poll, and I promise this is the last one. So thank you for bearing with us. Olivia, do you want to launch that? Great. And this question is about how comfortable you feel with the sense of what your land is worth financially. Okay. So a good spread here, but it seems like the majority of people on tonight feel like they have a little bit of a sense of what their land is worth financially. And that seems to me like actually a great starting point to launch into hearing from Ellen Anderson, who is a certified general real estate appraiser who works out of Petersham. She's also a town assessor. So I think that's very interesting, because they're different financial pieces of information, appraisal versus a town assessment, which I think Ellen will be getting into. She's been doing this work for more than 25 years, and she works regularly with Mount Grace and many other land trusts and conservation groups. So we're excited to hear from her next. So Ellen, if you want to unmute yourself, and the floor is yours. Or the Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really pleased to be invited to be with you, and watching what Krista has done and acknowledging what the land trusts are doing. I'm a little bit embarrassed, because all of the things that it sometimes seems that all of the qualities that make us want to protect land are things that don't seem to contribute to a high financial value. And so I do want to say that I have the following, here's what I believe about land. I believe it's a common good, and I believe it sustains all of us. And as an appraiser, though, I'm part of what's called the finance, insurance, and real estate industry. And it is actually the case that we view for many years, I think, and especially since the 1980s, we have viewed land as a commodity, like potatoes and shoes. And that comes up, that brings up some very odd results. And later I'd like Sarah to throw up a slide that shows how strange things can get when you actually look at land as a commodity. Nevertheless, that's what we do. And so in my discussion of appraisals, I think I'm going to try to throw in a little bit of a philosophy, a little bit of history. But the first thing that I want to do is to say that an appraisal, you need a land trust if you're going to have your property appraised, because the first thing you need to know is why you're doing the appraisal and who the user will be and who needs to pay for the appraisal, because in many cases it won't be you, it will be the land trust, or it will be the entity that's going to protect your land, maybe the state. And I have to say that we're lucky to be in Massachusetts, where there's a lot of support for land protection. We've got tons of local land trusts. In fact, I've heard somewhere that we have more land trusts in Massachusetts than any other state. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I have heard. And we have not only local land trusts, but we have statewide organizations such as Mass Audubon, Trustees of Reservations, New England Forestry Foundation. They've been around for a very long time. And we have the Commonwealth of Massachusetts itself, which has passed since the 1950s, has passed legislation creating conservation commissions and empowering them to acquire land and giving them resources to acquire land, so that your partners in protection of your land will be not only land trusts, large and small, but will also be the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and your local conservation commission. And so you really want to be working with all of those people. So money to support conservation projects comes from the state. It comes from the state's capital budget, from open space bonds. There's also federal money from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was just recently made permanent, and that's financed by taxes on fossil fuel companies. And most recently, there's the Commonwealth Conservation Land Tax Credit, where you can be reimbursed up to $75,000 for a donation of conservation land. So at some point, you probably will need an appraisal. And so what I'm going to do next is to try to tell you a little bit about what an appraisal is and what it is not. So just generally speaking, an appraisal is just an opinion of value, and it's communicated through an appraisal report. And the communication can be either written or it can be verbal, but it's always done as a specific date and for a specific purpose. Most of you probably have gotten appraisals for mortgages. And in that case, the bank comes into your house and it assumes that your house should be there. There's no reason to think that it should be something else. Or you've had an appraisal done by a tax assessor. And those appraisals are done for valuation purposes, and they are they're done nowadays basically by companies that use statistics and programs that are approved by the Massachusetts Department of Revenue. So neither of those kinds of appraisals requires a highest and best use analysis. It's assumed that the highest and best use of your property is with your house on it, basically. But if you're going to protect your land, then you have a question of highest and best use. And so that's what I would do. First thing, actually, there are 4 steps in determining highest and best use. And 2 of them are pretty straightforward. I'd like, Sarah, could you throw up the slide of the, and by the way, Krista, I picked this up just from a free mapping program. and it's just kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's not really land at all, but a parcel I've just kind of drawn on it for illustrative purposes. Let's see, waiting to see that. Yeah. Okay, can everybody see that? All right. So, and I've got two pieces of land here, and I want to talk about the first two tests of highest and best use. So here's a pretty looking piece of land. Can't you just see your house right in here? This is a road, and over here is another road. And this is a nice piece of forest land, and I'm sure you can see a nice house there. So as an appraiser, though, I'm going to say, what is the legal possibility for this land? What is legally permissible on these parcels? So this is road frontage here. And so I'm going to look at local zoning, and I'm going to see how many feet of frontage you need on a road, on this road, in this town, whatever it is, in order to build a house. And if the local zoning calls for 100 feet of frontage and this is 100 feet, then I know that it's legally permissible to put a house on this property. Now, there are other things too. We have setbacks, we have other legal impediments to development, but basically, I'm going to look at this piece of property and say that's about 50 feet of frontage, and so legally, I think I could put a house here, and it looks like a nice place. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say, well, there's, hundreds of feet of frontage here, so probably I could put house here, house here, house here, house here. So I've got my legal permissibility. Now, Sarah, can you put up the next slide?
Yeah, and just a quick note, Ellen, we can't see if you're using a cursor to point to one or the other. So if you wanted to mention maybe the parcel on the left or the right, that might help orient people.
Okay. Can you see the cursor as I move it around, though?
No,
no, you're not.
no, because we're sharing from my screen. So I can try to do that, but you might want to say the smaller parcel or the bigger parcel, or use some other locating.
Okay, I'm seeing it with my cursor, sorry. So
thank you.
Pull this over here. Here are these same two parcels on a USGS topographic map. And now you can see that there's a real physical problem here, isn't there? Because this is a wetland and this is a mountain. So although it's legally permissible, given local zoning, to build some houses here, it's obviously going to be, if we're looking now at the right slide, and the parcel on the right, is that making sense to people? Yeah, so we've got a mountain and we've got a wetland. So we've got our first test of highest and best use, which is what is legally permissible, indicates that we could have some residential development here. But our second test, what is physically possible, is going to be much more difficult. And so we're gonna have to get down on the ground and see exactly what the slopes are, and we're gonna have to look at the soils on the left and see if we can meet wetland setbacks. So the first two tests of the highest and best use of a piece of property are legal permissibility and financial feasibility. Okay, you can take those slides down. Great. The last two tests have to do with, again, what I said about viewing land as a commodity, because the last two tests are what is financially feasible and what is maximally productive to the land. So if I'm in a town where there are very few house lots selling, there's very little development, then I'm probably going to say that a piece of land has a very moderate financial feasibility for residential development or industrial development, because you could be in an industrial zone. So taking a really close look at the market in your town is going to be an important part of my job. Looking at how many houses are selling, how many building permits are issued in any year. So in many towns, after the last financial crisis, there were no building permits at all. And so financial feasibility is a really important test of the highest and best use of your property. And then after I've looked at the first 3 elements, I figure out which is maximally productive, which brings you the highest value for your land. And that way I can figure out what's the highest and best use of your land. After I've done that, then I have to go out and find what other kinds of properties are most comparable to your property. In other words, it's really important in an appraisal to go to the market and to find parcels of land that have the same highest and best use as your property. Very often appraisers will go out and they will say, well, this, they'll pick sales which really aren't comparable. So you want to make sure that you've got somebody that understands the market in your local area. And so that once they have the highest and best use of your property established, they can go out and find other sales that have a similar highest and best use. So again, we're looking at land as an asset class here. And many of the things that make the land so important to our society and to you and make us love it are things that may very well not contribute to a high value. Nevertheless, it's important to you because this land is your asset, to get the highest value that you can, and then decide how you want to protect your land, whether you want to do a gift, whether you want to donate your land, or whether you want to do a conservation restriction. So I think it's important for me to discuss next what a conservation restriction is. You probably already know that, but maybe you don't know exactly how a conservation restriction is actually appraised. So in order to do a conservation restriction, I actually have to appraise your property twice. The first time, the highest and best use is without the conservation restriction on it. So the second time, I do the same thing over again. I say what's legally permissible, what's physically possible, what's financially feasible, and what's maximally productive. But if you have removed residential potential or development potential from your property, then the highest and best use has changed, right? So you no longer can build houses. Maybe you can no longer build a factory. So what can you do? So it becomes very important what you actually can do. And a conservation restriction gives a landowner a lot of flexibility in deciding what actually they can do. So you're able to protect your meadows by mowing. I think somebody asked a question about, can I mow my meadow under a conservation restriction? If that's allowed under the conservation restriction, you definitely can. So what are the kinds of things that that people generally can do under a conservation restriction? Well, they can generally do forest management. They can do recreation. And so now having looked at the highest and best use as open space or as timberland or as agricultural land, you have to go back to the market and find sales of comparable properties with similar highest and best uses. And I think that's why a conservation appraisal is expensive, complicated, and something you want to think very carefully about with a land trust. So I want to go back actually because we started this webinar talking about how much land was protected in Massachusetts. And I think that Krista said that 25% was protected. I just read Mass Audubon's Losing Ground in 2020. And I think they said 27%. But things have been getting worse in recent years. And in my opinion, it's because our society very much looks at land as a commodity rather than as something that's intrinsic to our lives. So there's a slide. Could you put up, Sarah Wells, the slide of the, this is a slide from a report in Connecticut. It's not Massachusetts, it's Connecticut, where, let's see if I can move that around. Can you make that? I'm not actually seeing all of that on my screen. Can you make it? Can everybody see that? Because I cannot.
Okay. Yeah, I have it displaying. It's possible people can move the Zoom video box if it's showing up in the way, blocking it.
Here we go.
Okay.
Yeah, so here we have state of Connecticut. I can't see it at all, actually. Sorry. Can you get that back up, Sarah?
Sorry, that was strange. It got kicked off. That was the first. 9 months of Zoom, and there was the first. Okay, can people see that again? Okay, thank you. Sorry, Ellen.
So here's a case, here's a situation that I think we're facing everywhere in New England, where we've got a common good, which is providing solar facilities, and yet, at least in Connecticut and perhaps in Massachusetts, we're losing open space to solar facilities. And very often I'm asked whether the highest and best use of a piece of property might be to cover it with solar panels. And that pains me, because if we've made it so that it is, then I think that we're doing something that we should not be doing. And so one of the things that as an appraiser I try to do is to try to talk to people about their land as though it really isn't just a commodity, as though it is something that is the foundation of all of our lives. And I think that as land trust people, as land protection people, I think we have to really be questioning the appraisal industry and the whole process that we're going through as to how we really view land, and whether we can continue to have it be simply an asset class. I just want to raise that question because I get it a lot, and I think that people need to think about it. So what I really want to say to people is that conservation restrictions are really amazing instruments. They allow us, people who care about our land, to retain what we love about it, while also realizing the value that it is to us as a financial asset. And also although nothing is forever, a conservation restriction in Massachusetts is backed by the power of the state. The state signs off on it. It usually involves a conservation commission or a land trust, somebody local, to help the landowner, and it keeps the landowner on his property and allows the property to be passed along to heirs, so that people can stay on their land in a long-term way. And I think it's scalable, and it's something that's really a wonderful thing that we have at our disposal. It's complicated, but I think once you understand it, it's something that you will find extremely valuable. So I'm happy to take questions. It's hard to explain appraisals really quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
Ellen, I wonder if there is one question from Jan I want to make sure we get to in the chat, but could you speak for a moment about the difference between town assessments that people are very familiar with getting and paying taxes based off, and the appraisal, and how they can yield different values?
Sure. So an appraisal is done for it's first of all, nobody comes to your, well, they do come to your house and they do look at it. But the technique that's used is called mass valuation. And so they very often will look at the value of your land as, 1 acre of land is worth $43,000 or $45,000. And then they take the value of your house, looking at how much it would cost to build it, and then how depreciated it is. And then they add the two things together. So only if you file for an abatement is somebody actually going to come to your house and do an appraisal. So they're using statistical methods. If you think about it, it would not be possible for an appraiser to come to everybody's house and actually appraise it every year. So basically, it's a mass valuation technique at statistical, using methods approved by the Department of Revenue. Yes, you're looking for fair market value. Statistically, you generally get fair market value, but very often there's a difference between what the assessor says and what you would actually get out of an appraisal. And in particular, assessors don't usually, as I said earlier, they don't do a highest and best use analysis. So they're probably not going to value your land. They might even undervalue your land, and very often they do. So it's just a different technique, and it should be pretty close to correct. I have to say, in the town of Petersham, it's extremely close to correct. But there's often a difference, and it just comes from statistical differences. And yeah, and they don't do a highest and best use analysis. Does that answer the question, Sarah? Is there something else that you are thinking about?
No, that's great. Thank you. So Jan asked a while ago about, so she says her house stands on the land parcel of about 8 acres. And how does that affect the value of the land itself?
The house is on 8 acres. So, okay, well, so so let's just go through highest and best use analysis for you. So how much frontage do you have to have for a legal lot in your town? Who's asking the question?
I think she's saying she's not sure. So let's go with 200 feet.
Oh, okay. So do you have 200 feet of frontage on your street?
Well, we have the legal amount, whatever that is.
You have more than the legal amount?
Yes, a little bit more, not enough to subdivide into 2 lots.
Okay.
So we have a building lot with a house on it, and we also own about 7 acres that's out in back.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it has, that it would be buildable back there, and we don't want to build on it. But I'm not sure how you look at the value of property that's probably not buildable, but is legally a parcel with a house on it.
Right. Well, generally, having that extra land enhances the value of your property, and most people would like to live on 8 acres rather than 2 acres.
Sure.
But basically, the value of your property is a one house lot with an enhancement from the rear land. Yeah. So but on the other hand, if you had an abutter, you could probably sell maybe your extra land, and that might help if the abutter had some extra frontage. then the abutter could develop the land. But in general, you have a nice big house lot.
Okay. Thank you.
There's a two-part question from Chris. I think would be good to have Krista's opinion on too. So maybe the first part to you, Krista, about how do you get a land trust interested in your property and willing to pay for an appraisal? And he's noting that it was mentioned earlier that a property owner should not pay for the appraisal. So maybe do you want to address that and a little bit about when that may be the case and when a landowner needs to pay for an appraisal?
Sure. Well, the first question is how to get a land trust interested. And I think that you might use Krista's suggestion, go online and see if you've got some resources there that are ecologically significant. See whether you abut any other publicly owned or privately owned conservation land, or do you have a trail going through your property? All those kinds of things would interest a land trust or a conservation commission or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in having your land. And then if the state is interested in your land or a land trust, then they may very well be able to pay. They'll have to raise money to pay for the appraisal. And so generally you will not pay for that appraisal, because if the state's buying your land and the land trust is buying your land, they will have the responsibility of being the user of the appraisal. However, if you're getting a tax deduction, or if you're applying to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts tax credit program, then you have to pay for the appraisal. The land trust can't pay. So for a tax deduction, my understanding is that you have to pay. On the other hand, you get a tax deduction. Otherwise, it's probably the land trust will pay. Did that get it?
Krista, did you want to add to that from a land trust perspective?
Sure. I would just say in terms of how do you get a land trust interested, a lot of land trusts in Massachusetts are proactive in reaching out to landowners. They've done prioritization plans, and they will do mailings and workshops like this to try to get people interested in conservation. Doesn't mean that we get every, we identify every parcel that's worthy of conservation. So as Ellen said, knowing who your local land trust is and just reaching out to them, there's always going to be someone willing to talk. One of the things you would learn about land trust people is we never say no to when someone says they're interested in talking about land conservation. And then in terms of the appraisal, I can imagine scenarios in which sometimes we'll have a piece of land appraised and we go, oops, we know the landowner is not going to be happy with that number. Sometimes people know what the person next door got for their property and they think they can get that much, or when the larger a piece of property is and the more development potential, the more complicated it gets, because there are a million different ways you could sort of slice and dice it. You could do a huge subdivision or an open space subdivision.
I'm telling you, a subdivision.
That's, sorry?
It has to be frontage. Frontage. No, you don't have to have freaking frontage. You can.
Not here.
Krista, yeah. Maybe Olivia, maybe you want to check the audio stuff. But Krista, can you keep going with that?
Yeah, and so sometimes a landowner might want to have an appraisal done for themselves first and kind of have that number so they can enter into negotiations with a town or a land trust, kind of having a sense of what that value is. We've worked with landowners sometimes where we have one appraisal, they have another appraisal, and we agree to a price in between the two. So the other thing, and maybe Ellen mentioned this, I'm sorry if I missed it, but is that land appraisals are typically only good for about a year. and then after that point, you would want to get another one. So sometimes we do projects that go on for, well, I probably shouldn't say this, but rarely, you know, they'll go on for many, many, many years. So over the course of that time, we may get multiple appraisals, and sometimes the landowner will pay for that, and sometimes we'll pay for that. And so it's kind of situational.
You know, interestingly, for the IRS, they're only good for 60 days. If you have them done before you do your donation. So you can always get an appraisal done after you've made a donation, because the effective date of the appraisal will be the date of the donation. But the one big problem that comes up over and over again for me is that when you're applying for the conservation tax credit, they want an IRS qualified appraisal right then and there. And then, you know, because there isn't enough money in that fund to take care of all the people that actually are wanting to participate, you may wait 2 years for to be able to take advantage of that land tax. And then you do have to do the appraisal over again. So IRS appraisals have a very short shelf life if they're done prior to the donation. The Massachusetts and the tax credit program will let them go for a year. But again, we have relatively stable markets right now. I mean, so that a year doesn't make a difference. But I can imagine a scenario in which, an appraisal wouldn't be good for a year. I mean, if you have a huge crash or I mean, it used to be that when prices were going up so fast, 20 years ago, that people wanted them done way quicker than a year. So it really depends on the market, how good an appraisal, how long an appraisal will last, and on the regulations of whoever is financing or buying the property.
So there are some other things popping up in the chat, but I just want to circle back to the end of Chris's question that we answered the first two parts of, but they were wondering about whether we should assume that an appraisal provides less value than the assessed value or not. And I certainly wouldn't recommend that, but it might be good to remember that we're also not talking necessarily apples and oranges, because the town's assessment, if there's a home, will include the value of that home. And when we're getting an appraisal for the purposes of land and thinking about a conservation restriction, it's just the land. So the value of your house isn't going to show in that at all. So that's one maybe important distinction to think about. And there's another question that Betsy had asked about why you might get an appraisal if you're not trying to get a tax write-off. And that's, I think, a really good one. So, and I hope you don't mind, I'm interjecting with a land trust perspective from Mount Grace, and Krista hopefully can chime in too. But Ellen had mentioned earlier that when you have an appraisal done for a conservation restriction, the idea is that there is actual value to the rights that you're giving away in that document. And determining what that value is, especially if you have a property where there's a lot of development potential to begin with, means that theoretically you could be compensated for that value. We need the appraisal from the land trust side of things, because if we were to apply for a grant, we have to show why the appraisal is what gives the amount that we're asking for any real meaning. So we can't just make up a number and ask for that and use it to protect land. It has to be rooted in something real. And in this case, the something real is an appraisal. So that can be part of why there are different appraisals that come into play at different stages of a project, depending on your land and your goals or your family's goals and your time frame. I think that's part of the benefit of working with a land trust partner, again, if you're thinking about going the conservation route. But Krista, would you add anything to that or see any of that differently?
Yeah, I would just say that if a landowner is interested in donating land and not getting any compensation for it and not taking a tax deduction, that's amazing. And there may be no reason to have an appraisal done. And to claim a deduction on your tax return, you're required to get an appraisal if you're claiming over $5,000 worth of charitable donation. So if it was a piece of backland, you know, a couple of acres of wetland or something like that, that may not add up to more than $5,000 worth of land, you wouldn't need to get an appraisal. And you could actually still take a deduction for it if it was less than 5,000. But
there are a couple questions about cost. So one of them being the cost of an appraisal itself, and if there's a per acre price. Ellen, do you want to address that?
If the cost of the appraisal is related to the number of acres, is that the question?
Yeah.
No. The cost of the appraisal is usually related to the complexity of the problem, and also to the level of reporting that's required. So, for example, if you're getting money for for a forest legacy project, which I know, Sarah, you've been through this, right? The standards for the appraisal report are extremely high. Every T has got to be crossed, every I dotted. You've got to justify every adjustment. You pretty much end up with a Bible. It's extremely difficult, and you're going to be reviewed. And obviously, no appraisal is perfect, so you're probably going to have to do some stuff over again. If the reporting standards are extremely high, so that the appraiser has to do a lot of writing and produce, you know, a large, complicated document, or if the project is really complicated, so that you have to have sales of vacant land, sales of sales of improved. I mean, sometimes the IRS will actually ask you to appraise an entire property, the house and all. So it's related to number one, the complexity of the problem, and number two, the level of reporting that's required, really. Does that answer it? I mean, and we're talking in the thousands of dollars. We're not talking, you know, $500 or $600. So they're expensive. So if you are taking a tax deduction, I guess it's a cost of doing business. And if the land trust is doing the acquisition, then that's the business that they're in. That is that they'll just have to build that into their project costs.
Yeah, so to speak to the costs a little more, the ones that I've seen lately that would be used for including with a grant or for the type that a landowner would need for the IRS, they're usually between $1,500 and $2,500. And so Andy has a question also about costs, but not of the appraisal itself. So he's wondering, I think this is for you, Ellen, if you can give an average dollar value for land that has no frontage on a public way, that the value is really in the land itself, and in particular the timber that's on it.
So this is rear land with no road frontage?
That is my understanding, but Andy, if I'm getting that wrong, feel free to unmute and chime in.
Andy, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. So, well, do you have, first of all, I guess that you'd want to see the timber crews. In other words, if there's timber on the property and there's no road frontage, I'd want to know how you're going to get there to get the timber off, so that there'd still be a question of access. And then if it's extremely valuable timber and there's a way in there, then I would want to see the timber crews. and value it that way.
I'm
But-
just asking for an average, what you think.
Oh,
might be in it.
okay.
All of the land we have has access to it, all of it.
Okay, but it's all backland?
It's all backland, and there may be frontage on some of it. I don't know, but I don't care. I'm just asking for, what do you think an average would be on the poorest, the worst scenario?
The worst scenario without a conservation restriction on it. You know, I would say that somewhere from $900 to $1,500.
That's a good answer. Okay, that's all I want to hear.
I would chime in that out in the eastern part of the state, we tend to see higher per acre values for backland. Wetlands are like 2,500 an acre, and I've had undevelopable uplands felt like appraised at up to 10,000 an acre.
Not by me.
Yeah, it's like life in the ritzy suburbs.
I would imagine that would be a small piece of land too, right?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm asking Krista.
Oh, right, yeah, because there's sort of the bulk question, you know, with the bigger the piece of land, it becomes untouchable if you have per acre values that are too high. So
Right. Well, the thing is, again, if we're talking potatoes, the more potatoes in the barrel, the cheaper the price per potato, right? So, yeah,
Are we still talking about the same question?
maybe.
I don't
think
know.
so. I think
Yes.
so. Yeah. So if you're in Wellesley, it's probably first of all the parcels are smaller. I guess I was assuming from your question that you've got a rather large piece of land.
Well, we've got several pieces altogether, probably 3,000 acres of land,
Yeah.
but they're not all in one spot.
Okay.
That's why I just wanted to know what an average would be if it was a worst case scenario. It's just a
Yeah.
generic question.
Right. And if if there's just nothing, but I still think that's right. Yeah.
There's a question from Paul about the range of actual cost of appraisals in this case of 25 acres. So we've talked a little bit about that, but Ellen, would you want to say more about the potential range of cost in the appraisal itself?
Well, if it's just a fee acquisition, in other words, if all you're doing is doing one highest and best use analysis, then it's certainly, and again, would this be for, what would be the purpose of the appraisal? Is this Paul? Where's Paul? What's the purpose? What's the purpose of the appraisal? Because I guess it depends.
Potential conservation restriction.
Potential CR. Okay, so well, if I were doing a CR, I will need a range of sales before the CR and a range of sales after. So it's basically two appraisals, and you're saying 25 acres with no house on it. Probably 2,500. Yeah, probably. Does that answer the question?
I think so, but feel free, Paul, to chime in if not. Are there any other questions that we haven't gotten into yet that people want to unmute and ask, and probably have time for one or two more questions?
Yeah, I have a question about the tax deduction. Are there, assume you already have a bona fide CR and you've done the appraisal and the before and after value, so you know the value of the donation. Are there conditions under which this would not qualify as a charitable donation under IRS rules?
Krista,
So
do you want to?
you want me to do that, or who was that question for? Is that for me or for you, Sarah?
I think it could be for any of us. What comes to mind for me are if there's issues around private inurement, or basically the IRS doesn't like when people try to get tax benefits that for things that really only benefit them and not the public good. So the conservation restriction, or whatever you're claiming a benefit for, there needs to be some demonstrable good there, which Krista talked earlier about, things like drinking water supply and flood protection and habitat and trails. So those all help to help paint the picture. But Ellen, you might have a different take on what that question is about from your perspective.
No, I think you've answered it. I think there has to be, and it has to be permanent. It has to be a permanent conservation restriction. It has to protect. It has to have public good. Doesn't have to have public access, but does have to have public good.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, my impression was that if you'd gone through the process of getting the CR approved by the land trust, by the local government, and then by the state, that would be sufficient to prove it's public good.
I would think so. Sure.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's a timing consideration if you're interested in the tax credit program, because you have to be approved for it by the state before you go ahead and record that. But we'll have some other webinars later in the series, or if you want to talk about that offline, then happy to do that. But at this point, we're coming on 7:55. So I think we'll move toward wrapping up this particular workshop. I want to thank Ellen and Krista again for being here tonight and for everyone who asked questions. Kate, would you mind talking a bit about the evaluation and how people can get into that and why it matters to us?
Yes, so I'm about to put a link into the chat that will take you to a really quick evaluation form for the webinar tonight. It'll only take a minute or two to fill it out, but we use that to get a sense of what else would be helpful to you, how we can improve the webinars in the future, and how we can make sure we're addressing other topics that you may be interested in. So I'm pasting that link in now, and we'd really appreciate it if you took a moment to fill it out before heading out for the evening.
Great, thank you, Kate. Okay, so I think at this point, we will go ahead, if people can plan on taking a few moments to at least click that link, and it'll take you to another web page to fill out the evaluation. We'd really appreciate that. Beyond that, I think we'll mark this as the kind of formal end of the meeting, and we'll stop recording, and we'll give folks a minute or so to hop off if you'd like to. But if you have any questions or you want to stick around and talk to any of the presenters or the team, then you're welcome to do that. We'll just give people a minute or two to sign off if you'd like to. And otherwise, I hope you all have happy holidays, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
And if you haven't been on a Zoom before, you can leave by going to that red leave button at the bottom right hand of the corner.
Pamela Robinson, I see you have your hand raised. Does that mean you have a question? And if so, you're more than welcome to unmute and ask that question.